If you're a human being without any hearing loss, you can typically hear sounds between 20 hertz and 20,000 hertz. Now, you might think it's pretty quiet here on my little sound stage, but just below our range of hearing, it most certainly is not. But to hear those particular sounds, we need to record with a special microphone and then speed up the recording by a whole lot. And when we do that, whoa. I've done a whole lot of investigating and I still have absolutely no idea what's causing that sound. And it's still going on right now as I'm recording this. And if you're in a city or suburb, chances are that similar sounds are emanating just below your hearing range. And I have some bad news for you. A meta-analysis suggests that it can actually be pretty harmful to your health. Have you ever been to a particular place or maybe walked into a building and immediately felt like something was wrong? Like a rather noticeable and intense feeling of discomfort or maybe even fear, despite there not being anything notably wrong with the environment. And then the moment you leave that place, you start feeling better. Well, it turns out that there's a chance that it wasn't all in your imagination or anything paranormal. It could have just been infrasound. In this video, you're going to hear a lot of sounds that have never been heard before, recorded in familiar places with a special microphone that I made by modifying a seismograph. A lot of these recordings are from man-made places like airports or train yards, and some of them are from natural sources like the top of a supervolcano. More importantly, we're going to take a close look at infrasonic research and see how some types of these sounds can make people enjoy music less or feel incredibly ill, and according to one famous study, even see ghostly figures near them who aren't actually there. Let's go. I have amassed a vast library of weird sounds that human beings have not heard before. But before we can try and figure out what's going on in this hidden spectrum of sound, I need you to take a seat and make yourself a cozy cup of hot chocolate, because we need to have a word first. Nearly everything that we measure exists in a time series. This video, biological data, economic data, sociological data, and so on. Observing anything without a time-measuring yardstick is usually thought of as incomplete research. But philosophically speaking, this can have some major drawbacks, because some things simply do not have a beginning or an end. And if you're a frequent visitor of this channel, then you surely have realized by now that I am obsessed with the fact that different animal species perceive time differently than you or I do. In fact, you perceive time differently than I do. You also perceive time differently than you did yesterday or even an hour ago, because temporal resolution is always changing. And all of this reduces time to a more abstract measuring stick, and perhaps something that enables us to show up to video conferences or hair appointments at the same time that our fellow humans do. Way back around 500 BC, ancient Greeks were referring to time as two separate units of measurement. There was chronos, which was actual objective time, and then there was kairos, which was subjective time. And chronos, or objective time, could be measured by sundials during the day, and by night, one of the devices they used is called a clepsydra. It's a type of water clock that you could tune with a sundial, and I'm about to make the most basic version of it that has ever existed. So for this water to drain, it takes from here to here on a sundial. And now gravity does the job for us overnight. And there are some absolutely ingenious ancient clepsydra designs that continue running indefinitely, and they would eventually use water to power time measuring devices that looked more and more like mechanical clocks, until we eventually moved on from water as our clock power source. Sound and video is recorded and measured in a consistent time series, or chronos, but we experience these things in kairos. Differentiating between objective time and subjective time can be really important, if not vital, for research and philosophy. There are a whole lot of things in our universe that are completely obvious in one of those things, but completely obfuscated and hidden in the other. For example, only when the wavelength of light enters the human visible spectrum do we call it a color. We can't observe higher wavelengths like ultraviolet, but we can observe the effects of it when it burns our skin or causes cancer. And if you keep cranking up the frequency of invisible light to X-ray and gamma, even lower levels of light can eject electrons from atoms, leaving them with a positive charge, which more or less randomizes the fabric and makeup of whatever they're hitting. And for you or I, that means death. A lot of death. It goes without saying that when waves of pressure happen between 20 and 20,000 times per second and become audible to us, do we call it a sound. And while pressure waves above our range of hearing can give us headaches and hearing damage, it fortunately doesn't do anything as dramatic as rearranging atoms. But medical research is starting to trickle out data about the sounds that are happening below our range of hearing. And and things are looking quite a bit more sinister. For example, research has strongly suggested that infrasound can cause headaches, fatigue, loss of concentration, mood changes, depression, sleeping disorders, panic disorders, nausea, dizziness. I am very aware of the placebo effect and of course disclude my personal experiences with generated infrasound here in my lab when making this video, but I can tell you subjectively that it very much sucked, and even after turning the infrasound off, it took a while for things like intense nausea and dizziness to subside. A few years ago, a large published and peer-reviewed medical study showed that 100 decibels of infrasound, primarily around 10 hertz, caused a very negative effect on the heart's ability to contract, with a 9% decrease in contraction force for every 10 decibels above that. This research strongly suggests that your heart, an organ that some people would argue is necessary for survival, has to work quite a bit harder when you're exposed to high levels of infrasound, and this is on top of quite a bit of animal research suggesting negative effects on heart, liver, nervous system, and lungs. Another pretty scary thing is that this list is likely very incomplete due to the difficulty and lack of research on infrasound. It turns out that not many people want to volunteer to feel super uncomfortable while their organs may get damaged for some reason. Hey, editing Ben here. I just want to point out that if you look into this, a lot of the research that goes into the health effects of infrasound is overwhelmingly concentrated on infrasound caused by wind turbines. And yes, wind farms do generate infrasonic noise pollution. And it turns out that a lot of this research is either partially or completely funded by the fossil fuel industry to try and find something nefarious or wrong with wind energy. And this situation is a major problem in science and research. I did a video covering some of this here. So yes, wind farms do cause infrasonic noise pollution, while fracking in Texas, Oklahoma, British Columbia is literally causing record-breaking earthquakes. And how does the infrasound from all this fracking affect people? We don't really know because we haven't studied it nearly as much as wind farms. In the late 1990s, Vic Tandy, a respected lecturer and engineer, was working in a laboratory in Warwick, England that had a long reputation of being haunted. He felt a cold sweat and an intense feeling of depression, and out of the corner of his eye, he saw a blurry gray figure. When he turned to look at it, it vanished. And it turned out that his experience wasn't exactly unique in this particular lab. Like all British people, Vic was an avid fencer, and the next day he went to the lab, he decided to clamp his foil, which is what British people call their fencing swords, to a vise so he could oil it up, which is apparently something that British people do on their lunch breaks. He noticed that the sword started vibrating like a tuning fork. This led to him investigating things and realizing that a large fan was causing infrasonic vibrations around 18.9 hertz. You know what else resonates around 18 hertz? The human eye, and he attributed this to him seeing the apparition. And nevertheless, once the fan was adjusted and the infrasound was reduced, people stopped reporting weird symptoms from the lab. This would later be published in a rather famous paper titled The Ghost in the Machine. Soon after this, Vic visited another famously haunted place, a cellar in Coventry. Sure enough, he measured strong infrasound at 18.9 hertz. It's not the most conclusive study in the world, but pretty damn interesting. So let's hear it. Here's the recording that set this whole thing off for me. An entire 24-hour recording sped up to reveal these rumbles and drones, some of which turned on and off on a reliable, consistent schedule. Now, if I had to guess, air conditioners have a pump that removes excess condensation, and oftentimes they operate on a timer. Or perhaps a nearby water heater tank activated a gas main near the microphone every time the unused tank of water passed a temperature threshold. Okay, but check this out. 3:30 a.m. These are significantly loud rumbles that last for nearly 2 hours, and I have absolutely no idea, not even a guess, what the cause could be. So I put the microphone outside on battery power, away from footsteps or vehicles or air conditions or any type of interference, and left it on for weeks. And we still have these patterns of sounds that appear and disappear without any sort of obvious cause. I even strategically moved the microphone around to try and triangulate the source, and it was as if this sound just resonated all over my property, whether it was near a building or not. So let's check some other places. Here's a train engine starting up in a crowded train yard before departing across the country. Sped up, it sounds a bit like a vacuum cleaner. Now let's remove all of the audible frequencies and isolate the infrasonic ones. And and now it's a pretty consistent loud rumble. I set up my gear near the largest and busiest airport in the world, which is obviously an incredibly noise-polluted place. Let's isolate that infrasound again. Wow, I am not jealous of the people who live nearby. How about something that is synonymous with infrasound? A wind turbine on a large wind farm. There's definitely some infrasound, but not nearly as extreme as one would think from the news stories about this. But I really wanted to hear clear infrasound far away from any form of human infrastructure, and to do that, we had to drive over 1,500 miles to a particular spot south of Badlands National Park in South Dakota on the Oglala Reservation. From where I'm recording, the nearest paved road and infrastructure of any type is about 11 miles away, and it looks like this. So not exactly a teeming metropolis. The sound up here is remarkably quiet. If we amplify the infrasound by over 20 times the volume of everything else that you've heard in this video so far, we can hear what I assume is just wind hitting nearby rocks. But even inside the national park is a similar infrasonic tranquility. I even tried to record rumbles from bison, and it was remarkably silent in comparison to even remotely civilized areas. But this does not mean that nature is infrasonically quiet. The Earth can produce infrasound that humans can't even begin to compete with. This distant thunderstorm, for example, made a symphony of various rumbles. And there's some early research and testing on the accuracy of infrasound to detect and predict tornadoes. But driving about 500 miles west of there, and as high as 10,000 feet above sea level in areas of Yellowstone, we get to record and listen to the Earth's behavior atop the caldera of one of the largest volcanoes on the planet. These hot springs and geysers look like incredible and tempting places to swim, but many of them are exposed to hot vents of hydrogen sulfide underground. And the beautiful, refreshing pool you're seeing and hearing is actually filled with sulfuric acid. And unfortunately, some people threw caution to the wind and had to swim anyway. The most famous geyser in the world is Old Faithful, because it abides by a schedule humans can plan around and work with. And that doesn't make it any less cool. But aside from these extreme places or unusual events, the vast majority of infrasound that the average person is exposed to is caused by infrastructure. And unless you want to live here, there's little chance that you'll ever be able to escape it or even significantly reduce it. One of the reasons infrasound is so prominent everywhere is because the lower the frequency of waves, the longer the wavelengths, and this means that there are less compressions and rarefactions, or peaks and valleys in the waveform, per second. With sound, these are pressure waves in our atmosphere, and the farther away that these waves are, then the less they have to interact with the atmosphere, which means that they experience less entropy, which means that they get to travel farther before running out of energy. This principle also works for light waves too. The slowest frequency of human visible color is red, which is almost half the speed of violet. Fun fact, the reason red is the classic common choice for traffic and warning lights is because it's visible from farther distances. This could also be demonstrated mechanically with a simple pendulum. The shorter the chain, the shorter the frequency, and therefore more entropy. TLDR, the shorter chain will stop moving first. Now let's try and see a real-world example of how far infrasound can travel. EarthScope, SAGE, Raspberry Shake, and the USGS, to name a few, have open databases with thousands of seismographic displays that you can access in real time. And with a bit of basic API skills, you can even collect data for specific recent past events. And this amazing treasure chest of open information is necessary so a seismologist or geologist can compare their measurements to make sure that a vibration that they've detected wasn't just a localized event like a garbage truck driving by the building. If the data is of high quality and high resolution, I have a long carpal tunnel intensive workflow to transform the combined three-dimensional mini-seed vibration data into pascals, or units of oscillations of atmospheric pressure, or sound. More on this later, but for now, let's just try and find a really loud, rumbly event that happened in the last week. A few days ago, there was a SpaceX satellite launch near Lompoc, California. And California is pretty on edge about earthquakes, so there's quite a few seismographs to collect data from. And remember, we need to speed this up dramatically to hear the infrasound, and in this case, an hour of recorded data will be heard as 2 minutes of audio. This is what the launch sounds like 3 miles southeast of the launch site. And this is about 6 miles east. This is 27 miles away near Chachuma Lake. And this is a whopping 60 miles away in Santa Barbara. I was able to detect infrasonic abnormalities as far away as West Hollywood, over 142 miles away. And it's pretty wild to see that the sound had traveled for over 11 minutes before reaching that seismograph. Without getting too in the weeds with physics, it's worth pointing out that in many cases, infrasound is actually louder indoors than outdoors, even if the source is coming from outdoors. And this is due to a phenomenon called Helmholtz resonance. And a great example of an uncomfortable low-frequency Helmholtz resonance effect is when you're driving fast in a vehicle and a single rear window is opened up and you have this uncomfortable throbbing in your ears. In a previous video I did years back, I had an experiment with Helmholtz resonance where I intentionally resonated a Christmas ornament to try and generate air to try and find a way to extract energy from sound waves. And it worked in a very insignificant way. But this phenomenon and resonance can not only increase the volume and discomfort of infrasound, but it could change or split the frequencies, which makes figuring out the source of the sound a lot more difficult. In 2003, a group of scientists from the UK National Physical Laboratory held a live musical performance at the Liverpool Metropolitan Cathedral and then took a survey from the audience on how they felt during the music. In some of those music performances, they had a gigantic 23-foot infrasonic cannon tuned to 17.5 hertz, a frequency that didn't resonate the building in a way where it would shake things or create audible overtones, and they played that tone at 90 decibels while some of the music was played to people who were completely oblivious to what was actually going on. It turns out that people were quite a bit more likely to have felt uncomfortable during the performance when the infrasonic tone was playing, and 22% of the audience said that they felt some type of strange or unexplainable effect, such as sadness, chills, or even feelings of fear and anxiety. Fortunately for us, England was apparently quite obsessed with haunted infrasonic research in the early 2000s, and yet another study from Goldsmiths College, 4 researchers attempted to make a haunted room by filling it with various infrasonic frequencies and EMF, or electromagnetic frequencies. The sample size was actually pretty good for an experiment like this, with 18 participants being exposed to both EMF and infrasound, 23 participants being exposed to only EMF, 20 participants being exposed to only infrasound, and 18 participants being exposed to neither EMF or infrasound as a control group. Out of these groups, an average of 3.7 participants in the control group, those sitting in the empty room with nothing unusual happening, had some type of haunted experience. When infrasound was present, this number grew to an average of 5.2 people having a haunted experience. And in general, about 80% of the participants who spent 50 minutes in the room with infrasound or EMF felt dizzy or odd, or were quite a bit more likely to experience recurrent ideas, or feeling tingling sensations, or feeling an out-of-body experience, or feeling a presence in the room. Now, in my opinion, the study is fun, but not very well organized, and definitely not conclusive. A lot of times studies like this pique curiosity of other researchers to design more robust trials, and that's something that I certainly would like to try in the future. I would quite enjoy being a paranormal investigator, and also there's literally a video game series titled Benn Paranormal Investigator. Microphones receive signal from the vibrations caused by subtle changes in pressure on something called a diaphragm, which is a thin metal or plastic membrane or plate. What you don't hear about too often that drastically changes the way a microphone sounds is the air cavity between the diaphragm and the inductor, and the venting path for those pressure waves. There's a physical limit to how effective this air cavity is at moving the diaphragm, and in between that lower limit and 20,000 hertz is usually just a bunch of noise that you don't want anyway. And the majority of professional microphones have a high-pass filter anyway to remove whatever infrasound is capable of picking up. To get down to the really low stuff, like below 5 Hz or 3 Hz, even with special infrasonic microphones like this Earthworks, it just won't do the trick. You need a seismograph. I have a couple different seismographs and vibration loggers, but the Raspberry Shake 3D is probably the most convenient of the bunch, and it can measure an accurate frequency down to 0.5 Hz, which is literally 1 vibration motion per 2 seconds. And it can record much, much lower if you're isolating it well and if you're willing to filter your data. And this can be accomplished with some scripts in your command line and a lot of patience and computing power, but the problem is keeping time after you've left the seismograph format, since seismography is fiercely dependent on 100% accurate time, and this is where things get very mathy. Devices like the Raspberry Shake use Ethernet or Wi-Fi to synchronize time, so you can at least view the seismograph files as a reference to find notable waveforms. But what if you don't have internet access, like me for 90% of this project, and things got way more complicated? Quick disclaimer, none of the products that I'm talking about in this video are paid promotions, and I haven't even received any type of stuff at a discount, nor have any sort of relationship with the companies that other customers do not have. And this rare lack of bias is a gift from my Patreon supporters to you. For anybody in the audio world, I imagine that you might be willing to deal with an incomplete frequency range as a trade-off for not having to deal with collecting, time coding, and converting seismometer or seismograph data. In that case, if you're looking for a microphone that can pick up infrasonic frequencies, you'll probably be a little bit frustrated to find out that most microphones publish their frequency responses cutting off at 20 Hz. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not producing signal below 20 Hz, it just means that whoever tested their microphone didn't test it for under 20 Hz, because humans can't hear it anyway. Over the last decade, I have unquestionably tried out a lot of infrasonic range measurement microphones, and 99% of them will have a steep cutoff below 18 Hz, and only a small, very expensive handful will get anywhere near 10 Hz. If you want to spend under $1,000, the best microphone for this purpose that I've seen or used is the $500 Earthworks M23. It has a frequency response from 3 to 30 Hz, and supposedly it's also a wonderful measurement microphone, but I've never used it for its intended purpose. Infrasonic capable microphones do not have a high pass filter, so they're very sensitive to wind, and you typically want to use a dead cat on top of a normal wind filter, and that's what the microphone looks like. And of course, in the world of audio, you want to reduce vibrations from things like footsteps nearby the microphone, not so much the case with infrasound. I'll typically use a plate like this and put some skin cream or Vaseline on the bottom, and then put it on top of a rubber mat, and then just let it do its thing. But if you want to get into super low hertz territory, you're probably going to have to abandon the microphone completely. When making the video on the hum, I was using a sort of Frankenstein seismometer that utilized plastic tubes spread out to use the ground as a membrane. I think it looks way cooler and more scientific than it actually is, as the consistency is kind of far off. Another trick I used was this WIT motion accelerometer. It's a Bluetooth and USB gadget that costs around $40, and it's made for industrial equipment monitoring. I'd wrap a non-lubricated condom around a steel cup to act as a membrane and then place this puppy in the center. And sure enough, I'd get down below 1 Hertz, but again, poor consistency and not scientific grade measurement. But at least the steel cup didn't get pregnant. There's also a free app and project called Seismocloud, which can work with a sensor that you could purchase, or you could just slap together a $7 Node MCU Wi-Fi board, a $10 MCU 5060 accelerometer, and a few basic components. You will need a smartphone to record data with the Seismocloud app, and it's not terribly accurate, but it'll do. Although I could not verify for sure if you could export the data into a format that my app could transform into WAV files. The process of making this video has kind of reopened some questions I had about the hum phenomenon, and if you don't know what that is, I did a video on it a few years back, and it kind of ended up being the most significant and widespread coverage of the whole thing. Now, a few years later, if I'm able to get a GPS and a persistent battery working with the shake system and combine it with a pressure transducer, I'd be able to just easily take measurements all across the South and use machine learning to attempt to triangulate the sources. I obviously had a lot of time to think about these things while sitting in random places measuring sounds that I can't even hear. I have a feeling that the things that we learned in this video are definitely going to spawn off into other projects and other videos, and I hope it gets you into recording infrasound and contributing open data, or at least exploring seismographical data and learning more about the sounds outside of your hearing range. As usual, there are no sponsors for this video other than my community, and if you want to join that community or the Discord server or the forum and help make content like this possible and have access to tons of field recordings, some of which are ultrasonic or infrasonic, even ambisonic ones, then my Patreon is for you, and you can join for as little as $1. Hey, thanks for watching. Keep creating.